Hello everybody, welcome to another review here at the Graphic Library. I'm your host, Matthew McGuire. Today we'll be looking at a very special book. This is The Amazing Spider-Man by J. Michael Straczynski, or JMS, the very first out of 2 volumes. So The Amazing Spider-Man is the long-running Spider-Man series that has been in print since 1963. And this picks up around 1999 to about 2003, I think. So in this book we'll find The Amazing Spider-Man issues 30 through to 58, as well as issues 500 through to 514, and a director's cut of issue 509. Now you might be thinking, okay, well it seems like there's a lot missing in this book since we jumped from issue 58 to issue 500. Thing is, those are issues right next to each other, but when big books like this that have been running for a long time, they often get renumbered. So you get up to someone finishes their writing run, and then you go back to number 1. But then when you get to big milestones like the 500th issue, they revert back to their legacy numbering. So that's what happens here. So the 59th issue from the relaunch is actually the 500th issue overall, and that's why they revert back to that. So there's actually not anything missing in this run. It goes straight through issue by issue. And this is JMS, as I said before, who is very this run of his of Spider-Man is held as the modern definitive run. So it's really exciting to be able to talk about that. In terms of, I'm going to tackle sort of the overarching story here first, and then get into some of the characters and relationships, and then the smaller stories. So first, something that what JMS wanted to do was to introduce this grander mythos, or this grander lore when it comes to Spider-Man. Okay, so this book opens with Peter Parker meeting somebody who seems to be just like him, who has the same powers as him, whose name is Ezekiel. And Ezekiel explains to him that there's actually more to his powers than Peter Parker first thought. So traditionally and historically, Spider-Man got his powers from the radioactive spider bite, and that's it. Just sort of a freak accident of science. But while that is true, and JMS doesn't overwrite that, he does introduce something else. This sort of mystic, almost magical side where Spider-Man is perhaps chosen by some sort of spider god. I don't know, it's a whole thing. So that's what Peter Parker is confronted with first of all, and throughout this book he's sort of coming up against different enemies who seem to confirm this, and he has to wrestle with this a bit. And one of those enemies is actually a guy named Morlun, who is a spider vampire. He himself isn't a spider. He is a vampire, and he drains the essence of spider people. This might sound familiar to some people because this is the premise of Spider-Verse, the big comic event, not the movie. Which happens in 2015 or 2014. But all of that big event where a bunch of spider people have together to protect themselves from these interdimensional vampires who are trying to drain their essences. All of that starts here with this idea. We see Peter Parker, Spider-Man, meet his match with this spider vampire, as I said earlier, whose name is Morlun. And then we also see some other spider-related villains that Peter Parker goes up against. So you have this magical moth creature who hunts spiders, as well as a swarm of spiders who take over New York. And these are all they were almost prophesied by Ezekiel himself. He said these people are coming, these 3 in particular. That sort of gives credit to this whole magical, mystical mythos that Spider-Man has to come up against. In terms of Peter's relationships and the other characters that we see, there isn't a huge cast of returning characters. So you get Aunt May, you get Mary Jane, and I think that's about it really in terms of returning characters. In terms of new characters, you get Ezekiel, and again I think there's not much else. not many other people have a substantial contribution to this story, which I think is helpful because it helps you to focus on Spider-Man and really flesh out these key relationships in his life. So at this point, Peter Parker isn't living with Aunt May anymore because he's a grown adult. There seems to be this idea that Spider-Man's perpetually trapped as a teenager in high school or, is fresh in college. But that's not the case. Peter Parker ages. So he's a grown man who has his own apartment, but he still, has this relationship with Aunt May that he maintains. And a really interesting thing that happens early on is that Aunt May discovers that he's Spider-Man, probably for the fourth time. And you see the sort of fallout from this and how their relationship tracks through this discovery. Again, going back to this idea that Peter Parker isn't trapped in his teens, isn't trapped in high school. At this point, he is married to MJ. He's married to Mary Jane. And even though they are separated and are split, living on the two different coasts of America, they are pretty deep into this marriage. So these relationships between Peter and May and Peter and MJ, I think, are the key relationships within this book, and they're the key characters. And I think there's one particular issue that lays a lot of groundwork for this. I forget which particular year it is. It might be 2002. But early 2000s, there's this one particular month where all running titles in Marvel, they were published under this banner of Nuff Said. And in it, there would only be illustrations in each book, in each issue. So only about 20 pages, but there was only illustrations. There was no writing at all. And that's not just dialogue, but no narration either. So this is something that I've read a few issues here and there, and they tend to be really great, really stellar issues. And the one in this book is no exception. So we get, Mary Jane tackling this idea of having her own life, her own life of glamour in LA as a supermodel, but being sort of haunted by, the life she left behind in New York. And you see the same of Spider-Man, reverse, him living this life of Spider-Man in New York, but haunted by, leaving MJ behind. And you see some really great parallels there. And as well as you see May's reaction to finding out that Peter Parker is Spider-Man and the ways that she goes about that, both positive and negative. So I just feel like, this particular issue where there's no words at all, no writing, really powerfully lays the foundational work for the relationships that we see, especially since it's so early in this book. Everything else really builds off of this, which I think is really impressive. And what else I think is really refreshing in this is that after one conversation, things aren't just back to normal. So Peter and May go to LA to see MJ, and they actually leave without her again. Because, they're separated, and just one conversation isn't going to fix everything, especially when you have supervillains following you all the way to LA. So I think that's fairly realistic. But what that enables is JMS to weave again throughout this book this story of MJ and Peter slowly coming back together, missing each other sometimes as well, but eventually being able to sit down and have a honest conversation. And then we see what happens from that. So while the mystic side of Peter's spider powers and Ezekiel and all that take up the main narrative of this book, a lot of the character development and character exploration is taken up by Peter, May, and MJ navigating these feelings around each other. You do have some really interesting side plots and side characters in this book as well. I need to apologize because I did lie to you. I said that Peter is no longer trapped in high school. That's not strictly true, because very early in this book he decides to become a high school science teacher, because isn't that the dream, just to dedicate your whole life to being a teacher and serving the very grateful and manageable and respecting students of this world. Anyway, and you see Peter Parker sort of as a man, outside of the spider suit, have to deal with the very real problems of being a teacher in a low socioeconomic area, and the ways that he sort of approaches that. And you see that both inside the classroom and also him helping his students outside the classroom. You get some other stories really short, but really great. So one is this man who creates the costumes for superheroes and supervillains. I think that's a very sort of poignant, lighthearted story with some really great moments. And then you get a really sort of ethically bound story with Spider-Man being employed by a mobster to stop a monster. Who's the real monster? Who's to say? But yeah, this is a story which is really well written and brings up some really interesting questions ethically for Spider-Man. And I think it's really well done and comes to a satisfying ending as well. And then we get into issue 500, which I mentioned before. And it's sort of this great homage to Spider-Man and his history. I won't get into it, but some plot contrivances happen and Spider-Man is blasted through time and he experiences both the future and the past at the same time, and sort of, jumps back and forth between them and fights his way through his own history. One thing I thought was really interesting, so it's a series of flashbacks as Spider-Man is fighting these different villains. So for example, you have him fighting Sandman, but this is actually, each of these panels is a sort of a direct homage and recreation of really, really old Amazing Spider-Man panels where Spider-Man is fighting these villains. So all of these that I'm about to show up happened within the first 10 issues of Spider-Man. So you have him fighting Sandman, and then there's, of course, the issue from the 1960s, and then you have him fighting the Vulture, and again, this is the issue from very early on in the Amazing Spider-Man, and then you have him fighting the Lizard as well, with the same thing. And then, so that all happens early on in the Amazing Spider-Man, and then we jump forward to, I think it might be issue 121. Someone might need to fact check me there. But of course, here we see the death of Gwen Stacy, which is probably the most traumatic event in Spider-Man's history. His girlfriend that he wasn't able to save. And this jump through time is really interesting because it's actually the only time in this entire book that we see Spider-Man's rogues gallery. So when I say rogues gallery, I mean the villains that he fights. One thing everybody knows about Spider-Man is he has really colourful, inventive, eccentric villains. And you might have noticed, but so far they've been completely absent from this story. JMS doesn't draw on any of these villains, just like he doesn't really draw on a whole heap of Spider-Man supporting cast. He really narrows the characters and he brings in his own villains, which on paper doesn't sound like it'll work. Taking the villains out of Spider-Man, but in execution, and I don't know how he does this, but JMS just really pulls it off, and it's really, really good. Although there is one exception to that, in that Dr. Otto Octavius, the guy with the, I don't need to explain who he is. He does make an appearance briefly in the first half of this book, although that is only because there is a new villain that JMS introduces, which is based off of him. So you need him there for that conflict. And also he dated Aunt May. So again, it's drawing on those like previous relationships, which is so weird. Anyway, so he's the one exception to this, but apart from him and apart from the 1 or 2 issues he's in, the villains are completely absent from this book. Now, within this book, there are some heavier, more darker stories that are only a couple issues. I think there might actually only be 1 issue each. And JMS sort of tackles this to varying degrees of success. So as I said before, Peter Parker gets a job in a high school, and very early on in his career, there is an event which he has to deal with, which is a school shooter. Of course, Spider-Man stops him and that sort of thing. But especially to an American audience, this can be quite confronting. I don't think this was done particularly badly at all. I just thought it was an interesting take. Later on in this book, you have, so Spider-Man is spending a lot of time in these low socioeconomic neighborhoods, and he has to deal with this African-American teenager who has a gun and, is about to be confronted by these police, and Spider-Man can see this going down the wrong way, so he intervenes. And I think this is a story which is probably better, the best of the done out of the three that I'm going to talk about, because you see, just a seriousness to this, and it's just more well executed, I think. So this book started in 1999 and went to about 2003 or 4. The one thing that happened in the world at that time was the bombing of the World Trade Center, or 9/11. And that's something that JMS and Marvel Editorial decided to dedicate one issue in this book to sort of exploring if that sort of happened as well in the Marvel universe. I think overall it's a very tasteful idea in terms of the idea itself. It's sort of this dedication to the sort of real heroes of New York, the firefighters, the police, and that sort of thing. And it's almost like a rally to stand together at this time. I just don't think the dialogue is the best. I think it might be trying a little bit too hard there, and if they tried to do a bit less, then maybe it would have been executed a bit better. This does, of course, contain one really controversial page, which is this page of some of the villains of Marvel being emotionally affected by this bombing. And of the villains, you have Magneto, who is himself a mutant terrorist. You have Doctor Doom, who is a dictator and an enemy of the US. And you have the Kingpin, who wants to rule New York. The Kingpin would be the only one who should be really, grieving a loss here. It's just a really interesting inclusion to have the other two especially. And now I'm going to talk just briefly about the art. So this artist, who I should have mentioned up top, is John Romita Jr., who did most of this book. He is very well known and established in the comics community. Apparently his art earlier on was a lot better, but for me personally, I'm not a huge fan of his art in this book. To me, the faces always seem a bit off or dopey, and he just has a very blocky texture. I once described his characters in this as sort of dopey Roblox characters. One thing I do really like in his art is how he draws webs, which is a small thing, but it's less small in Spider-Man. But I just really enjoy the way that he draws webs, either the sort of all-encompassing webs or just like the single threads. I think it's really impressive and really brings something to the book. So this isn't just totally hating on JR or John Romita Jr. I think it takes a lot of skill for the writer and the illustrator to work together to make things funny. I don't think people acknowledge in comics how just how much the art and the writing need to go together to help each other out. And I've come across a few different books where the art is great and the writing is great, but they just don't really work together all the time. So I think it's such an achievement that JMS and John Romita Jr. are able to really work together to pull off not only these really funny comic panels and really funny moments, but also some really natural dialogue and some real characters. Now, everything I've talked about so far is about 90% of the book. There is one arc in the end, which is about 6 issues, and this isn't illustrated by John Romita Jr., so Mike Deodato Jr. takes over at this point. And this is an example of his art, which is it's such a breath of fresh air to me every time I read this. It's sort of just I forgot. Again, no offense to John Romita Jr. You turn the page to the first illustration that Mike Deodato Jr. does. I forgot that, art can be like this. And, there's something to be said about the realistic versus stylized art in comic books. And I think, it's a spectrum where both can work. But when you go from this to something like this, it doesn't, you really appreciate the breath of fresh air. Unfortunately, that's about the only thing that you appreciate from this arc. So, J. Michael Straczynski has a lot of freedom when he's writing Spider-Man, but, he's still bound by Marvel Editorial. and they wanted him to include the story, so he did. So this is a story called Sins Past, and basically Peter gets this letter, which seems to be, and it's an incomplete letter, but it seems to be from Gwen Stacy, who, as you recall, was one of his first girlfriends who, died, courtesy of Emma Stone. But yeah, so he gets this letter, and then while this is happening, he also gets assailed by these two unknown figures. One of their masks come off during this fight, and it's somebody who looks exactly like Gwen Stacy, and who claims to be her daughter. Okay? So yeah, you get this reveal that Gwen had two kids, a daughter and a son, and they've come back to attack Spider-Man because they think that he killed her. So you get these series of flashbacks through the letter and through MJ, where you find out that Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin, the murdering psychopathic supervillain, who is the father of one of Gwen Stacy's best friends, is the one who is the father of Gwen Stacy's children. Now, you might be thinking that sounds a little odd, and you're right. And it's just this really bizarre and honestly quite disgusting story that Marvel decided they wanted to include. I don't know, they just wanted to shake things up for the sake of edginess. But yeah, it's just really, it's not fun to read. And it's just, just a really sad story. And it's, it's, well, I was going to say it's not badly executed, because I like JMS, but it is badly executed. Because I don't think there is, like, you could have Steven Spielberg writing this, and it can't be well executed. So it's not J. Michael Straczynski's fault at all. But it's just this really low point in, I'm going to say, Spider-Man history. Yeah, overall, this is a very, very fun, dynamic Spider-Man book, and it is the definitive modern run of Spider-Man, if you're looking to get into the Amazing Spider-Man. Very easy to get into, really strong character work. While throughout most of it, the art isn't great, the illustrations and the writing together lend itself to very real relationships, real conversations, real people, as well as just funny moments. And I think JMS introduces this really interesting idea of the mystic spider mythos into Spider-Man, which is really fun to see how it plays out in this book and the next. And overall you just have some really great, compelling stories, driven by a great and compelling Spider-Man. If you're looking to get into Spider-Man at all, this is the book to do it. If you enjoyed this, please leave a like. If you want to see more, please subscribe. And if you have anything to say or any questions, leave a comment. For now, this is a little sneak peek at what we're going to be looking at in 2 weeks' time. And until then, I'll see you next time. Thank you.